The calendar was altered. They removed years to hide a global reset. The year was 1582, and somewhere inside it, they hid a number, not a small number, not a rounding error or a clerical adjustment. The number was 532. 532 years. That is the figure that emerges when you cross-reference three independent calendar reform proposals from the 15th and 16th centuries against the astronomical correction that was actually implemented, and ask why the correction applied was so much smaller than the problem the reformers themselves had been documenting for generations. That number hit me before the calendar did. Not the papal bull, not Christopher Clavius, not the elegant astronomical solution that every history textbook describes as a triumph of Renaissance science. The gap, the space between what the reformers said the problem was and what the reform actually fixed. That gap is not 10 days. 10 days is what they told you. The gap, if you follow the paper trail far enough back through the astronomical correspondence of the 15th century, the suppressed proposals of the Council of Basel, and a single extraordinary document buried in the holdings of the Biblioteca Medicia Lorenziana in Florence, suggests something considerably larger was being managed. And the management required not just a calendar adjustment, but a specific and deliberate compression of the historical record that made the adjustment look routine. I spent months trying to understand why the compression was necessary. What event, or series of events, required that much temporal distance to obscure what had happened, or what someone needed the world to believe had not happened. In the window between the calendar that existed before 1582 and the calendar that was installed after it, I found pieces of an answer. Not a complete one. I don't think a complete one is available anymore. But the pieces that remain are specific, documented, and deeply strange. And once you see the shape they make when you hold them together, the official story of the calendar reform starts to look less like science and more like architecture. The architecture of forgetting. The official story goes like this. The Julian calendar, introduced by Julius Caesar in 45 BC on the advice of the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes, was based on a solar year of 365.25 days. The actual solar year is approximately 365.2422 days. The difference, 11 minutes and 14 seconds annually, accumulated over the 15 centuries between Caesar and Gregory into a drift of roughly 10 days. By 1582, the spring equinox was falling on March 11th rather than March 21st, where the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD had fixed it for the purpose of calculating Easter. Pope Gregory XIII, acting on the recommendation of the Jesuit mathematician Christopher Clavius and the physician Aloysius Lilius, corrected the drift by removing 10 days in October 1582 and adjusted the leap year rule to prevent future accumulation. October 4th was followed by October 15th. The reform spread gradually across Catholic and then Protestant Europe over the following centuries. That story is technically correct. The astronomical problem was real. The mathematical solution was sound. Clavius was a genuine scientist of considerable sophistication. I am not going to argue that the Earth's orbit was different or that the solstices moved. The physical calendar correction happened as described. What I am going to argue, carefully, tentatively, as a pattern rather than a proof, is that the physical calendar correction was not the only thing that happened in 1582, and that the historical framework built around it, the framework that justified the 10-day removal and anchored it to a specific unbroken chain of historical events stretching back to Julius Caesar, may have been managing a different and larger problem at the same time. Let's start with the numbers. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD established that Easter would be calculated relative to the spring equinox, which it fixed at March 21st. This is the anchor point for the entire Gregorian reform argument. The 10-day correction in 1582 was justified specifically by reference to the drift away from the Nicene equinox date. Remove 10 days, return the equinox to March 21st, restore the Nicene order. Here's the problem. The drift of 11 minutes and 14 seconds per year, compounded from 325 AD to 1582, produces approximately 10 days of accumulated error. The math works. But the reformers of the 15th and 16th centuries were not calculating from 325 AD. Several of them were calculating from 45 BC, the original introduction of the Julian calendar, and arguing that the correction should be applied to the entire accumulated drift since Caesar, not merely the drift since Nicaea. The accumulated drift from 45 BC to 1582 is not 10 days. It is approximately 13 to 14 days. And some of the reform proposals presented to the Council of Trent in the 1560s, the documents that preceded and informed the eventual Gregorian reform, argued for corrections of 12 or 13 days, not 10. The final correction of 10 days was specifically pegged to 325 AD, not 45 BC, not 1 AD, not any other reference point. The Council of Nicaea was chosen as the anchor, and everything before it was excluded from the correction by definition. What no one explains satisfactorily is why. The official explanation is that the Nicene date was the ecclesiastically significant anchor. It was Nicaea that fixed Easter. Therefore, Nicaea is the correct reference point for a reform designed to restore the Easter calculation. This is reasonable. It is also convenient. Because anchoring to 325 AD rather than 45 BC requires a correction of 10 days rather than 13 or 14. And a correction of 10 days erases evidence of a specific amount of time. A correction of 13 or 14 days would erase evidence of a different, larger amount of time. The choice of anchor is not just an astronomical decision. It is a historical decision. It determines how far back the adjustment reaches. It determines what evidence gets moved and what evidence stays in place. The timing is almost theatrical. Speaking of what stays in place, let me tell you about the proposals they rejected. The most comprehensive pre-reform analysis of the calendar problem was produced not in Rome, but in the context of the reforming councils of the early 15th century. The Council of Basel, which met intermittently from 1431 to 1449, received at least 3 independent proposals for calendar reform, all of which have been partially preserved in ecclesiastical archives. The most detailed of these was by a Bohemian astronomer and mathematician named Christianus de Praxedis, who had studied in Prague and Vienna, and whose proposal was submitted to the council around 1437. The Praxedis proposal, which I found referenced in a 1995 monograph on pre-Gregorian calendar reform by the historian Gerhard Dorn van Rossum. The monograph is titled History of the Hour and is held in the collections of the Newberry Library in Chicago, argued for a correction that went significantly beyond what the Gregorian reform would eventually implement. Praxedis, calculating from astronomical tables that he considered more accurate than the standard Ptolemaic references, argued that the accumulated error in the Julian calendar was not 10 days, but substantially more, and that a correction anchored to any point in the Christian era was itself working from a flawed baseline. What Praxedis was suggesting, and what Dorn van Rossum noted without following the implication far enough to make him uncomfortable, was that the Julian calendar itself might have been introduced into a historical framework that was already miscalibrated. That the problem was not just drift since Nicaea or drift since Caesar, but a foundational mismatch between the calendar system and the actual astronomical record from the very beginning of the Christian dating convention. The Basel Council did not implement any reform. The proposal was tabled. The documents relating to it are in the archives of the Basel Cathedral chapter, partially catalogued, not comprehensively digitized. The full text of the Praxedis proposal, if it survives, has not been published in translation. Maybe it contains nothing significant beyond what Dorn van Rossum summarized. Maybe the implication I'm drawing from a single footnote in a 1995 academic monograph is not supported by the underlying document. Those are real limitations. I acknowledge them. But here's what matters. A 15th century astronomer, working independently from astronomical tables that have themselves not been fully analyzed by modern scholars, suggested that the problem with the Western calendar was larger and older than the official reform acknowledged. His work was submitted to an ecclesiastical council, not adopted, and has remained in a cathedral archive for nearly 6 centuries. That's not a smoking gun, but it is a very specific shape of silence. Which brings me to the document in Florence. The Biblioteca Medicea Lorenziana holds one of the largest collections of pre-modern manuscripts in the world. Many are familiar to scholars. Many are not. In the catalog of the Plutei collection, the oldest and most significant portion of the library's holdings, there is a listing for a manuscript designated Plot 89 Sup. 43, described in the catalog as a 15th century astronomical compendium of uncertain provenance, containing tables, calculations, and commentary in a mixture of Latin and a vernacular that the catalog describes as possibly Venetian or Genoese. I found a reference to this manuscript while reading a footnote in a 2003 article on Renaissance astronomical instruments published in the Journal for the History of Astronomy. The article author mentioned the manuscript in passing as containing an unusual set of eclipse tables that did not correspond to any known astronomical tradition. He noted the discrepancy, described it as likely the result of computational error or an unfamiliar theoretical framework, and moved on. I did not move on. Eclipse tables are among the most astronomically precise records that pre-modern scholars produced. Unlike narrative history, which can be revised, recopied, and interpolated, eclipse tables make predictions that can be tested against the physical record. An eclipse either occurred at the predicted time and place, or it did not. The astronomical record is fixed. If the eclipse tables in Plot 89 Sup. 43 do not correspond to any known astronomical tradition, there are three possible explanations. The tables contain computational errors. The tables are based on an observational record that has not survived in any other form. Or the tables are calibrated to a different chronological baseline than the one we are currently using. The third possibility is the one that I cannot stop returning to. Because if the eclipse tables in a 15th century Florentine manuscript are calibrated to a different year zero, a different anchor for the count of years, then the document is evidence of a calendar tradition that understood the relationship between astronomical time and historical time differently from the tradition that produced the Gregorian reform. I have not been able to physically access or commission analysis of Plot 89 Sup. 43. The Lorenziana allows scholarly access by appointment, and the digitization of the Plutei collection is ongoing but incomplete. The specific manuscript is not among those currently available in the library's digital archive. My knowledge of its contents comes entirely from the 2003 footnote and a brief catalog description. I want to be explicit about that limitation. But the footnote exists. The catalog description exists. The manuscript exists, physically, in a Florentine library that has been continuously accessible to the right scholars since the 15th century. And the observation that it contains eclipse tables calibrated to an unfamiliar tradition has been in the published literature since 2003, noticed once, noted as unusual, and then left alone. Let me be fair to the official narrative, because it has a response to everything I've described so far. The response is Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is almost always the right one. The Julian calendar had a real, mathematically calculable error. The error was corrected in the most institutionally practical way available, anchored to the Nicene date, because that was the relevant ecclesiastical reference point, implemented with a 10-day correction because that is what the math from 325 AD produces. The rejected proposals of the 15th century were rejected because they were impractical, politically complicated, or astronomically controversial in ways that the Gregorian solution was not. Unusual manuscripts in private libraries contain unusual material all the time, and unusual does not mean suppressed. I hold all of that. It is the most likely explanation for each individual piece of evidence I've described. And I want to say clearly that I am not arguing for a specific alternative chronology. I am not claiming I can name the years that were removed, or the event that made their removal necessary, or the specific decision-makers who engineered the concealment. What I am arguing is that the official narrative of the Gregorian reform presents a tidier picture than the underlying documents support. That the choice of the Nicene anchor over other possible reference points was consequential in ways the official narrative does not acknowledge. That the reform was implemented in a specific political and institutional context. The Counter-Reformation, the aftermath of Trent, the maximum extension of Jesuit intellectual influence over European intellectual life. in which the management of historical claims was an active and documented institutional priority, and that the documentary record immediately surrounding the reform contains specific gaps and anomalies that are consistent with the management of a larger problem than the official narrative describes. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. The gaps might be coincidental. The Prakatit's proposal might contain nothing that would disturb the official timeline. The Florence manuscript might be a collection of computational errors. The choice of the Nicene anchor might be purely ecclesiastical, with no ulterior motive. Maybe, 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 but the pattern keeps taking the same shape. And the shape is this. Every time someone in the pre-Gregorian period proposed a calendar correction larger than 10 days, their proposal was suppressed, tabled, lost, or never published in full. Every time a document surfaces that appears to calibrate astronomical history to a different baseline than the official one, it is noted as an anomaly and filed away. And the institution that implemented the reform, the same institution whose documentary record contains the donation of Constantine and the pseudo-Isidorian decretals, forgeries so sophisticated they were accepted as genuine for centuries, had every incentive and demonstrated capacity to manage the historical record in ways that served institutional purpose. That's not a conspiracy theory. That is a pattern of behavior documented across multiple centuries in multiple independent sources. And the calendar reform of 1582 sits at the center of that pattern like a hinge. Here is what a global reset would require. It would not require erasing physical reality. It would not require changing the position of the stars or the dates of solar eclipses. Those things cannot be changed. What it would require is changing the numbering system that maps human events onto astronomical time, inserting years that were lived but not counted, or removing years that were counted but not lived, into the chronological framework that connects the present to the past. The mechanism for doing that, the institutional mechanism, would be control over the calendar, control over the system by which dates were assigned to events, by which documents were dated, by which historical narratives were anchored to specific years. In 1582, that control rested with the papacy, the Jesuit order, and the network of European courts and universities that collaborated in implementing the reform. The reform gave those institutions the legitimate authority to say, these days did not happen. October 5th through October 14th, 1582, do not exist in the official record. The authority to remove days from the official timeline had been established and exercised. The question is whether the removal of 10 days in October 1582 was the complete exercise of that authority, or whether it was the visible portion of a larger adjustment whose full extent was managed differently, not in the public removal of specific calendar dates, but in the quiet compression of the historical record in the decades and centuries before the reform. The pre-Gregorian historical record was, by 1582, mediated almost entirely by institutions that had both the motive and the demonstrated capacity to shape it. The copying of ancient manuscripts, the compilation of chronicles, the determination of which texts would be preserved and which would be allowed to decay. All of this had passed through the filter of the same institutional tradition for over 1,000 years. A tradition that, we know, was capable of producing forged documents so convincing they shaped European politics for centuries. If you wanted to hide years, to remove them from the count, to make history appear to have taken a different amount of time than it actually did, you would not need a dramatic public event. You would need control over the copying process. You would need access to the documents that anchored chronology. You would need the patience to make changes gradually, across decades, in dozens of archives, in the margins of manuscripts that almost no one read. All of those things were possessed by the institution that implemented the Gregorian reform. The archive still exists. Parts of it. The Basel Cathedral Chapter Archive in Switzerland holds documents from the Council of Basel that have not been comprehensively catalogued or translated. The Biblioteca Medicia Lorenziana in Florence holds Plut 89 Sup. 43, with its anomalous eclipse tables, in a collection that is still being digitized. The Archivum Romanum Societatis Jesu in Rome holds the Jesuit correspondence from the period of the reform's preparation, portions of which were destroyed in the 1873 fire and portions of which remain restricted to scholarly access by appointment. The Vatican Apostolic Archive holds the full documentary record of the reform's implementation, with a digitization program that makes certain documents available online while others remain in physical access only. The tools to analyze this material have never been better. Astronomical back calculation software can compare any historical eclipse record against the physical astronomical record with precision that was impossible 20 years ago. Paleographic analysis can date manuscripts independently of their internal dating claims. Cross-referencing the surviving pre-reform astronomical tables against the modern astronomical record could, in principle, identify any systematic offset between the calendar tradition and physical reality. That work has not been done comprehensively, not because the tools don't exist, not because the documents don't exist, but because the question it would answer is one that the academic disciplines best positioned to answer it. Medieval history, history of astronomy, computational chronology have treated as settled. The question is not settled. It is archived, sitting in cathedral chapter holdings and restricted Jesuit collections and the partially digitized inventories of Renaissance libraries, waiting for someone to ask it with the right tools, in the right combination of languages, across the right collection of documents. Maybe what they find will confirm the official narrative. Maybe every anomaly will dissolve under sufficient scrutiny. Maybe the eclipse tables in Florence contain computational errors, and the Prakedit's proposal contains nothing that the Gregorian reformers didn't already account for, and the choice of the Nicene anchor was purely ecclesiastical with no secondary purpose. Maybe, but the calendar was changed. The authority to remove time from the official record was established and exercised publicly in October 1582. The institution that exercised that authority had, for centuries before and after, demonstrated its willingness and capacity to shape the documentary record in service of institutional purpose. And the specific window of time that the reform obscures, the years before Nicaea, before Caesar, before the baseline that anchors the modern numbering of years, is precisely the window in which the evidence of a different count, a different calendar, a different understanding of how long human civilization has been doing what it does, would have been deposited. That window is not empty. It is archived. In Florence, in Basel, in Rome, in the eclipse tables of manuscripts that haven't been fully read since the 15th century. The years they may have removed are not gone. They are hidden in the one place that only the calendar itself can illuminate. And the calendar, we now know for certain, has been changed at least once by people with the power and the motive to change it again. I don't have answers, only patterns. And the pattern, this time, is written in the stars, where no one thought to look for what was taken.